It's fairly well known that in the Middle Ages there was something of an arms race occurring. Armorers were trying to account for all of the new dangers on the battlefield, and weapon makers were trying to find new ways to defeat the advancements in armor. Now, during the 13th to 14th centuries, there was a period that was called transitional for armor, and that was because they were making a transition from the kind of chainmail or mail armor, which was small interlocked rings, to full plate. And that full plate would be what we kind of classically think of as a suit of armor. But this transitional period had a bit of both. And during this time, swords were adapting as well. They went from being more cut-centric to being thrust-centric in nature in order to account for these changes in armor. But there was one type of sword that got caught somewhere in between, and this is Oakeshot's Type XIV sword. We're going to take a look at an example of this with the Kingston Arms Type XIV sword designed by Angus Trim. The second in a series of performance-oriented swords designed by Angus Trim and produced by Kingston Arms, this 13th century style arming sword has a very slight forward balance, making it quick in the hand and devastating in the cut. Based on Oakeshot's Type XIV specifications, these swords were used in the 13th to early 14th century in that transitional period from mail armor to the full plate worn in the 15th century. This sword is therefore more cut-oriented than later period swords, with a more acute point than earlier examples. This melding of the cut and thrust ability coincides perfectly with the use of the sword and shield or buckler of the time. It seems odd that during my time doing reviews on this channel that I've never actually talked about a traditional Type XIV style arming sword such as this one by Kingston Arms. And it's very surprising because this is actually probably one of my favorite types of swords, but I've just never actually had one. And I really find short, kind of mobile arming swords to actually be one of my favorite designs because it allows me to have very quick, effective strikes, have that nice balance between cut and thrust, and with something that honestly, because of its size, is very easy just to carry around on your person. I actually have a feeling that these type of swords were actually very, very common as that kind of traditional sidearm that swords were well known for being, because it was so easy to have on your hip, on your belt, and it wouldn't necessarily get in the way as much as maybe a long sword would, just kind of in daily use and walking around. Now, the Kingston Arms version of this was designed by Angus Trim, or Angus Trim, and he's a very, very well-known American sword designer, swordsmith, and for good reason, because his designs are actually extremely well thought out. They are designed with all the elements that you'd really want in a good functional sword. And as we go through talking about this specific example, I'm going to be talking a lot about its functionality because there's a lot to say about a Type XIV style sword. And I'm going to also try to account for some of what I would be talking about for Type XIV in general, since this is really the first time I've actually done it. But let's start, as we always do, with some basic aesthetics. I feel that Kingston Arms, under the kind of Cast Iberia umbrella, that specific maker though, Kingston Arms, has done an incredibly good job of making sure that their swords are well implemented. They are beautiful looking, they are simple, they are clean, they are elegant. These are the kind of typical things you'd want to see, or at least I would want to see, in a good medieval European style sword. Now, I will say that in general, while it's a very clean implementation, there are no real obvious flaws in the design of the blade or anything. Because this is kind of one of those sub $800 swords, you will begin to see some of the typical failures that you see, both aesthetically and to some extent potentially functionally, when it comes to implementation. The big one that I would actually talk about is the gap right here between the blade and the crossguard. It's not the largest gap, but it is very apparent. It may not have a huge negative impact functionally, but aesthetically it could maybe be a little bit cleaner. The cross piece kind of flares out, as you can see, just a little bit. It's not that big a deal. Again, it's not something that is really going to hamper the functionality of the sword per se, but I think it does show a little bit of an obvious aesthetical gap. Now the blade itself is really nice, clean, really beautiful. This has been sharpened, and there is a noticeable secondary bevel, but the secondary bevel is extremely clean. So they did a very good job in sharpening this sword to ensure that it doesn't really take away from the overall profile of the blade. One of the things that I really like about a Type 14 is actually the taper profile of the blade, where it's very, very wide here at the base, and as you get closer to essentially the tip or the weak of the blade, it begins to taper pretty heavily. This has actually always been one of my favorite designs for an arming sword in terms of just overall profile. And of course, with a typical Type 14 sword, you also have this fuller that goes about 2/3 down the length of the blade, and the fuller again has been very well implemented. It looks really nice, very clean. There is really nothing about the blade of this sword that I would really actually have major concern with. I think they did an incredibly good job of implementing it. Now the crossguard, as I noted, had that little bit of a gap, but otherwise it's really pretty nice, pretty standard, really basic. It's a little bit thin, actually, as you can see. The protections for the hands are probably going to be more reliant on armor that you might have on your hands, because especially the way it's designed, it really actually exposes your hand pretty well to any type of blows that you might actually block with the cross. Now, all that being said, of course, it's going to be the standard that you're actually going to be using probably a shield or a buckler with this. So you're actually protecting your hands in other ways, but it's at least important to note that, you know, you're not necessarily always going to be parrying with the cross in terms of using this sword. The grip is extremely well done. It's nice, and it's again very clean. It's very reminiscent of what you might see in like an Albion sword, or what we have seen in other Kingston Arms swords, where it's a compressed leather that has been cord wrapped and I would imagine epoxied on. It's very, very firm. It's not going to move. It's basically one solid piece with the sword. And then the pommel is a very, very basic wheel pommel, and it's got a real basic peen on it. Nothing real special, but you can tell it is a peen construction. Aesthetically, again, I have no real problems with the sword besides that gap, and that gap actually becomes more of a concern for me, potential long-term use in terms of functionality, although it never actually tended to be one from a functional side. Now, speaking of functionality, this is where I think this sword both shines, as well as can be very interesting as kind of a telling piece for a Type 14 sword. Now, when you're talking about the functional use of a Type 14 sword, you're really talking about it being used in conjunction with a buckler. And so I want to speak about it in terms of being a functional piece just as a sword standing on its own, and then a little bit about how it could be used with a buckler and how that matters in terms of the design. So, in general, when we're talking about the agility of the sword, with a Type 14, I want to have really good agility. You'd be doing a lot of cuts that are actually really well out in front of you, especially with buckler use. You would actually have your hands out in front of you, and the ability to cut around it and have that good agility is absolutely crucial. And with a good arming sword, you want to have that nimbleness, and you also, with the Type 14, need good point control. Now, these are all things that this sword basically has. So you can see I can actually keep the point fairly standard where I want it to be. And its ability to cut isn't really hampered by the design. It's the beauty of a Type 14 sword, is that it really does actually have that good cut ability. When I did cut tests, I was actually doing two things with cut tests. One that will actually be a video that I will produce in the future, specifically talking about different types of tatami. But when I was cutting against tatami targets, I found that it was actually extremely easy. For the most part. There was one of the mats that I actually experimented not soaking as long, and it certainly had a lot more resistance, but I was still able to get into it fairly well. Finding the actual cutting portion of this blade is fairly easy, because it's right here near the tip where the fuller basically disappears. So you know exactly where to cut with the blade, and that's actually extremely beneficial, because it means that you don't have to do a lot of thinking around how you're going to cut. It's kind of exactly where you'd expect it to be. But the cutability of the sword, the using of it for the purpose of the cut, seems to have no problem. Of course, because of how this is sharpened, it's extremely sharp. This is a very, very sharp sword as it came to me, and because of that, I, again, had no problem getting through targets. Now, in terms of overall agility and usability, when we look at the agility graph, you can actually see just how mobile this sword is, both in being able to move in the kind of lateral directions up and down in something like a thrust, but as well as in a cut. And again, this is what you would expect to see in a cut and thrust sword. You're not going to sacrifice any one aspect over the other. Now, the drawback of this, of course, is that you're going to actually have two things with this sword, which I don't actually view as a negative, but some people might. One is overall length, because it is a relatively short sword, but the other one is, of course, going to be overall mass. This is coming in under a kilogram in terms of total weight, and because of that, it is extremely light, it's extremely mobile, but it means that the effective cut for it is going to be fairly low compared to maybe more traditional arming swords. Again, does that really matter when you're talking about maybe having a little bit of a trade-off so you can have a good thrust ability with it? And when you're talking about, again, using a buckler, that lightweight doesn't really hamper it because you're again out in front of your body. A lot of what you see in manuals such as the I-33 manual is people fighting out here, and because they're fighting out here, and yes, you would cut around, because it's all out in front of you, that can be extremely tiring if it was a heavy sword. In fact, I wouldn't view that as being really possible with more traditional arming swords. To this extent, this is where Kingston Arms has really benefited from the Angus Trim design, because Angus Trim is well known for having swords that are extremely beautiful to handle. They feel really great in the hands, and this one is no exception. Now, keep in mind, this is being implemented outside of Gus's control. He gives the specifications for the sword, for the blade, in terms of how it's going to be profiled, how much it's going to weigh, what the design is going to be, but he's not implementing it. And that's really important to note, because I think there are some things that you would expect that would be implemented slightly differently if he was the one doing it, such as the gap in the cross. But it's not a huge deal because it's implemented well to his specifications, and it shows. It feels really good. They actually make notes on a couple websites that sell this that, you know, if you're going to modify this, understand you could potentially be modifying the potential handling characteristics of it. And that's an important note in general, but I don't think this is something that needs to be modified. This sword works really well right out of the box as it is. And I think that's extremely good. I think it's extremely telling, both of Gus's ability to design really nice swords, as well as Kingston Arms now, in my opinion, improving reputation in making really good swords. I think back to the previous Kingston Arms sword that I did review, and that was back when I did a scoring system. My scoring system kind of just had it mostly at mediocre. I felt like the price was a bit high considering the overall quality and handling characteristics of the sword. A lot of this comes down to the type of sword they're making. They're doing a rigid sword for an arming sword with a hollow grind, and ended up just weighing more than I think it really needed to. This is the exact opposite. I think this is a beautiful sword that handles really well, extremely well designed single-handed sword, and I'm really, really happy with it. In overall, in terms of functionality, I haven't had any loosening with this. Again, that little bit of a gap could have been a concern. There's been no loosening of any components when I've used it. I've actually used this sword a lot more than I have other swords that I do reviews of, in terms of just trying to get used to it and trying to get to understand the weapon. Again, first time I've been doing a Type 14 style sword, but on top of that, I really just have found a lot of enjoyment using this weapon. In fact, it's quickly becoming probably one of my overall favorites that I've been able to use. And I'm heavily considering at the time of recording this review actually just purchasing it. So it was sent to me by Cass Iberia to do the review, and I would be sending it back to them, but I'm tempted because I really, really like this sword. I think I'd be hard-pressed to find a Type 14 that is at the price range this sits at, and is still as wonderfully functional and beautiful to use, and the agility being what it is. I think it's the perfect balance of price point, a good designer, and again, a manufacturer who's beginning to have, in my opinion, an ever-growing positive reputation in Kingston Arms. Now, of course, this sword does actually also come with a scabbard. I do actually want to speak to it. It's a pretty basic wood core scabbard. This is pretty standard for Kingston Arms. I had a little bit of trouble with it a while back, that the sword didn't quite fit well, and it took a lot of taking the sword out, and putting it back in to make it actually finally fit snug enough, but also not get caught. It was actually getting caught at right about that distance out of the scabbard, just a little bit of blade exposed. It didn't quite fit as snugly as I wanted it to, but after a little bit of use, yeah, it all fit in. The scabbard was fine. It's a wood core scabbard. It actually rattles a bit, but because it holds the sword, I'm happy with it overall. And really, again, the sword is kind of the showstopper here. This is the piece that matters. The scabbard is just a really good bonus that comes with it. But I think that Kingston Arms has done an incredibly good job with this. They kind of said this is their second iteration, or their kind of second design coming out of their Kingston Arms line. And I think they've done a really good job on their second showing. So I am excited to see more of what Kingston Arms has to show us. I'm excited to see more of Gus Trim's designs come out so we can benefit from his knowledge and his skill in designing wonderful swords. And yes, I am extremely happy with this sword. So if you're looking for a Type 14 arming sword, you might want to check out this Kingston Arms arming sword from Cast Iberia. It's a beautiful sword. I think it's going to be exactly what you're looking for at a really good price point. One that I think couldn't be argued for being anything but very generous to us as consumers. So this is it. This is the Kingston Arms Type 14 Arming Sword, designed by Gus Trim. I hope you enjoyed this review. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. You can also check out Medieval Review on Patreon.